Well, Trump, in his usual bolshy, brash tweeting style, has hit back, rubbishing the polls. Just let's look at the tweet. The same people who did the phony election polls are now looking at these approval ratings, rubbishing them. He does, I think, have a leg to stand on after the election polls got it so wrong.
I'm tired of parsing what we think Donald Trump really meant. We don't know whether he really thinks it's rigged or not, or it's just kind of what comes out of his Twitter brain. It's really, it really doesn't really matter. Yes, polls are wrong. Polls are wrong all the time.
So what does a Trump victory mean for the world and for us? Sitting on the tip of Africa to discuss, we're now joined by author and professor from Wits School of Governance, Patrick Bond. We're also joined by branding and advertising expert Andy Rice. A great pleasure to have both of you gentlemen. Let's start with you, Patrick, and starting with Trumponomics. Does anyone really know what that means? How do you understand that term?
Well, I think it's going to probably take the form of construction, infrastructure, and let's call it very carbon-intensive infrastructure, so pipelines for oil and gas that he personally, his company has shares in, roads, bridges, airports, not the clean, not the green infrastructure. He's not interested in that. He's a climate denialist still. He's put in charge of State Department, Environmental Protection Agency, lots of people who want to keep polluting. But then also he's put massive tax cuts on the table for corporations and a tax amnesty. He's hoping that the biggest companies, the Apples, for example, that we know they cheat with their taxes. They cheated Ireland. That's been documented. Would they bring the money back to the United States? And then his assumption, if they're bringing it back because of an amnesty, these illicit financial flows, will they reinvest? The investment rates are very low there. And I think the investment rates are low because of overinvestment at the global scale, and his carrots will only generate more buybacks of shares. So the companies aren't going to put up new plant and equipment in greenfield. You know, they're not going to really invest. He has a few isolated cases where he's bully boyed a few of the car companies, for example, to not relocate. That's pretty minor. The bigger story is a continued crisis, and all he really can do is build stuff. He's a developer. He does construction. He puts his name on buildings. Now it'll have to be the government name. He's still holding his own huge investment portfolio in especially hotels, casinos, that sort of thing. But it's not going to work. And those 55,000 people who voted for him instead of for Clinton, working class whites in 3 states that could have shifted the election, they'll be heartbroken. I'm
picking up that you agree with even the economics Nobel Prize winner last year, saying that this won't be good, especially if he's isolationist and things like that. It won't be good for the United States or the world.
He's a con man, the world's greatest ever, I think. So we don't know if he'll do a trade war, but he likes to posture. He said to China, maybe we're going to question the one China policy. You know, that got South Africa in a bit of trouble last month over the trip by the Chouani mayor, Solly Msiminga. That one China policy, Trump says maybe we'll negotiate a better trade deal if we put that on the table as a question. I mean, that's kind of zany geopolitical madness to mess around. And so the Chinese are very, very upset. They're talking war talk. And then, of course, not just a 45% import tariff on imported goods from China that he's threatened. It's all sorts of like climate denialism. I mean, that's a global economic catastrophe that he's messing with.
All right, let's look at the Trump brand, Andy, because a lot of people are still scratching their heads as to how Trump got here. The polls were wrong. You have an interesting branding theory. Tell me about it.
Well, I think many people feel that brands belong in supermarkets and in retail environments, and that's the only place where they operate. But that's far from the case. The reality is that anything that you're prepared to invest some emotional energy into is a brand. And in politics, brands are extremely powerful. And we've seen, not just in the Trump scenario, but in other major political earthquakes in the last 2 years, we've seen brands at work there. Because if you accept that a brand contains a product within it, that's the kind of nuts and bolts and the functionality, but that's wrapped up in how you feel about that product, and that's the emotional side of things. Then we see that the emotional strength of a brand will trump, sorry about the bad pun, the functionality of an opponent's product every time. So what did we see in...
So emotion works, basically.
Emotion works. What did we see in Brexit? We saw people who were canvassing for remaining in the European Union using pie charts and statistics and large amounts of money and functional, rational arguments. And they were up against a party that said, actually, we'd like to regain control of our own country. Now, that's an enormously powerful emotional message versus the functional reality of the Remainers. We saw the same with the rise of the EFF. The reality is that their proposition is almost entirely emotional. We've seen it now in the case of Trump, where I would argue that Hillary Clinton's principal arsenal of weapons was data, knowledge, facts, information. And Trump's arsenal was principally around saying, let's make America great again. And that is a very persuasive argument.
She was sterile. And this whole make America great argument, I'd like to ask you both. Some would say, Obama would say, unemployment is at incredible lows. America is great, but it still resonated, didn't it?
Well, it's not great for those people that Patrick was talking about who are caught in an economic trap and who are being promised a way out of it by a different economic approach. It remains to be seen whether it can work.
Andy, that's true. I mean, these people who got jobs to make the unemployment rate decline, they're part-time jobs, there's no benefits. The situation is very, very fragile. There's even a new word for this working class, not a proletariat, a precariat. They have a precarious life. And yes, so they had a choice, left-wing populism. Bernie Sanders, a senator from Vermont, got a lot of support. But then when the Clinton, partly through quite illicit means, it's turned out, got rid of him in the primaries, some of these working class voters, 43% of trade unionists, even though the trade unions supported Hillary, 43% of their members supported Trump, hoping that that rhetoric would work. Yes, Hillary Clinton was sterile, but she was establishment, more importantly. She was the candidate who was closest, say, to Goldman Sachs. It's ironic because now Trump has appointed 5 top people from Goldman Sachs, including the Treasury Secretary, right at the top of his administration.
There was one of those Goldman Sachs, ex-Goldman Sachs guys, Anthony Scaramucci, speaking at Davos this week, and talk about branding. I thought he spoke very well. He was interpreting Trump for the crowd. So I'd like to just ask you about what he said. In a nutshell, he said that America has helped the world for years, especially since the war, pumping money into other economies, helping their manufacturing. And it's been good for everybody, but America is simply asking now for more symmetrical trade relations, basically going back to something that's more fair. It sounds very rational, doesn't it?
They're con men. I mean, they're extremely good at distorting reality. Anyone that's been in any trade negotiation knows that the US comes and absolutely blasts you. And this is especially true of the Obama and Clinton administration. I mean, they were really pushing their corporate interests so hard that when Trump says they did bad deals, he's really making it up to appeal to this crowd. He talks left, he'll walk right. And that's clear when he brings, for example, these top guys. We call them the 4Gs. It's Goldman Sachs in the cabinet, a bunch of generals in what should be civilian positions. Then it's gas guzzlers, like these high-carbon ExxonMobil CEO Steve Tillerson. And then it's the gazillionaires, his other mates who are billionaires right there. So those 4Gs really show to the working class who voted for him they made a big mistake.
Yeah. So let's talk about that working class and branding. I'm trying to link this all. But globalization, I think everybody is talking about the people that are being left out. Some people have been left out. So if you're in a low-income country, you can do simple manufacturing. If you're in a high-income country, if you're not a banker or a tech genius, if you're a blue-collar worker, maybe you are being left out. So is the Trump brand compelling, or does he just happen to be at the right place in history, I guess, when there is so much frustration?
Well, almost by definition, it's compelling. He won the election. But I think that that compelling message is built on shaky foundations, again, as Patrick was making clear. I think that what we have to recognize is that a brand is not a static thing at any one moment in time. It has to progress, and it makes promises along the way. And a true brand is one that understands that a promise made and kept is the hallmark of a true brand. So now, I suspect by gross oversimplification of issues in order to make them appealing to people who are perhaps not as politically savvy as some others, Donald Trump has wooed them in on promises that are unlikely to be kept, and that's what we're going to need to watch.
So do you agree that he's a conman, and what will happen to his brand then? Because he does seem to have some room to make statements and then turn his back on them, say, I'm going to put Hillary in jail, and then say, oh no, it's fine now, and his supporters forgive him. Has he created a different brand where he can be very flexible, if that makes sense?
No, I think a brand has to be consistent, and it remains to be seen whether the hot flames of the election period are seen to be representative, or whether people will judge him by actually what he does, and I'm not sure that's going to be any better. But the reality is that he has surrounded himself with people who perhaps don't instill any greater confidence than he himself, and we need to see in due course whether it's a deliberate conniving strategy or whether it is just a desperate attempt to solidify his power base.
We'll come back to what he means for the American brand. You are quite incensed about the climate change issues. You're saying that maybe there will be a global backlash, sanctions against the United States. Could we see that coordinated action?
Absolutely. You know, friends, I just spent the last 3 weeks in Washington. I really felt not only were the various fragmented victims of Trump. You know, these are going to be oppressed peoples, all women. You know, reproductive rights will be withdrawn at the first time the Supreme Court meets with the new justice. They'll be basically racism against African Americans, Latinos, Muslims, maybe a registry of Muslims that won't be allowed in the country if those promises are held. You know, gays, lesbians, social justice activists, trade unionists. It's going to be a very rough time for a large group of people. And I found them coming together. The question is, like in this country in the early 60s, will they call for sanctions against their country? Because Nicolas Sarkozy, the former French president, said, if Trump goes out of the climate deal, then we should put a 3% carbon tax on US products, because our companies, he would say in French, are going to be uncompetitive. Naomi Klein, a great writer and climate activist, has said full economic sanctions. And now the sanctions on the brand Trump, they're working. I mean, for example, Coca-Cola had to pull back a year ago from supporting Trump in the Republican convention because anti-racist activists had a big petition, 100,000 clicktivists signed online. And Coca-Cola was so intimidated they didn't give Trump 600,000. Right now there are two big campaigns. One is called Sleeping Giants, which is campaigning on venues and social media to stop companies advertising with the pro-Trump e-zines, like especially Breitbart.com. And secondly, a very, very interesting campaign called Grab Your Wallet, #GrabYourWallet, that came up after Trump's misogynist remarks in that bus with Billy Bush were revealed, that's boycotting anything to do with Trump, anything to do with even Ivanka Trump, his daughter's clothing line. So there's very interesting resistance. And the brand Trump, I think, Andy, you'd agree, has devalued the United States. A sanctions movement is quite conceivable.
So tell me what you think about brand Trump and about brand America. I remember years ago, it was fashionable at Wits to talk about America, how terrible it was, all these clandestine deals, and then Obama came along and changed everything, for me certainly. What does the inauguration tomorrow mean?
Well, I think one of the things that it might trigger is a very interesting collection of more active commercial brands, because they're going to want to fight against this same devaluation of brand America. I mean, everyone on both sides of the divide share a common interest in seeing America staying a powerful force in the world. And I'm interested in the fact that many brands over the last decade have been adding some kind of social purpose to their proposition to the market. So it's not just it's tastier, faster, sweeter, washes whiter, but it also leaves some kind of legacy or impact within the community that they serve. And brands are doing this more and more, brands with social purpose. This might just be an issue that will unite the private sector, mobilizing their brands to act against what they see as an ugly force. Now we see already that Nando's have been running a campaign in the US saying these are all the minorities that we welcome here in Nando's. So they've already started in their typical satirical and irreverent way. They've started to say we do not stand for the persecution of minorities that appears to be coming out of the Trump bandwagon. We welcome all of these minorities.
But those car manufacturers you were talking about, it seems like they've been strong-armed in a sense. They're saying, yes, we will toe the line, basically. So it involves companies being brave, perhaps like they have to be here as well.
Absolutely.
But can I say, if that doesn't happen, and I fear not that many companies will have the courage to fight the President of the United States, the formula that Adolf Hitler used, he brought in a car company, Volkswagen, he brought in Siemens. And when you combine state power by a right-wing lunatic with big corporate power and then a socio-cultural reactionary sensibility, there's a word for that. It begins with an F, fascism. And the United States stands on the edge of going fascist if the attacks on these companies, if sanctions, if these social media critiques of companies in collaboration with Donald Trump aren't successful. If you're wrong and I'm wrong, it's a very, very dangerous situation.
A lot of people have been wondering, jump in if you'd like to at any point, what this means for Africa. And we don't really know because he doesn't have much of an Africa policy. We are locked into AGOA because, of course, our exporters have benefited from access to the US market. How do you see this playing out for Africa?
Look, in my view, I think he'll toss out every trade deal he sees and every opportunity to drop out of international conventions. Like the climate, it should take him 3 years because of the techniques. He might just drop out of the UNFCCC itself, the whole UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, then it's only 1 year. That's the threat. His climate denialism is the default position, Reince Priebus, his chief of staff, says. And yes, the same for trade. AGOA, which particularly benefits auto exports, because he's promised car workers, auto workers in these Rust Belt states, he'll do everything to bring them back. I would say that's a pretty vulnerable deal, along with all other trade deals. He's a protectionist.
It's an often quoted figure that something like 75% of all American adults don't own a passport. They don't travel outside of America. And a common criticism of news services in the States is that if it didn't happen between San Francisco and New York, it didn't happen at all. So I think what is likely to be the outcome is that very America-centered viewpoint of Middle America will now become even more government policy. And I worry for Africa in terms of civil society being increasingly starved of funds, because a fair amount of the funding coming into very important civil society initiatives is coming from, in one way or another, from sources in the US. And if that is somehow strangled, then I think we will feel it here in terms of developmental issues.
We're running out of time, so I'd like to ask you both, do you think he'll actually last 4 years? What do you see for the next 4 years?
He's liable to be impeached, partly because he's taking emoluments, foreign gifts or payments. And his rebuttal in his press conference last week is, when I have an international guest in my hotel, I'm giving fair value. So that's a huge contestation. Is he violation of the Constitution, which prevents him from profiting from foreigners? Now that's the easiest thing that they'll start fighting. But there's something else that's so worrying, which is Trumpism without Trump. His cabinet, full of big, fairly nasty corporates, generals, gazillionaires, they hang in, and they have new president, Mike Pence, and he comes from the far right, Christian fundamentalist plus climate denialist, and the Koch brothers, big funders of the far right, and Dick Cheney stands very close to them, very dangerous man from the Bush years. That would be worse, because then this Trumpism could continue without the oaf who represents its Achilles heel, the individual.
Do you think he'll last?
Well, in my less well-informed way about American politics than Patrick, I look at someone like Reagan, who came into a position and was criticized for lack of depth and lack of political savvy. But he at least surrounded himself with people who were considered to be competent, appropriate administrators. And he restrained from making too many comments himself, other than witty one-liners when he got shot and things like that. Unfortunately, Trump is a very different person. He has an ego the size of the Washington Monument, and he is determined to put his personal stamp on everything. So I think he will make a few fundamentally crazy moves, And one of them, one hopes, perhaps might well be enough to trigger impeachment.
Yeah, I was feeling depressed, but maybe he'll go. Thank you so much, both of you. That was Andy Rush, Chair of Brand Consultancy Yellowwood, Professor Patrick Bond from Wits. And that's unfortunately all we have time for. Thank you for being with us on Prime Time Business News. We will be crossing, of course, to SABC US correspondent Sherwin Bryce Peace at 6:30. He will be there following all the action, all the protests, the run-up to the inauguration tomorrow. Who will be performing, who won't be? We'll take you there.